Wanted to address this because this is said a lot by people of color, and quite frankly, it's just getting annoying. Let's talk about this phrase that's always said, stolen land. A lot of times you guys misspell conquered. You don't go around saying the Persians stole land from the Romans, so why do you only do it against Caucasians?
Reverend Isaac Simmons lived in Amite County, Mississippi, and owned 270 acres of land that had been in his family since 1887. This was very unusual among black families in the South, where racism and poverty had made it very difficult to own any land. Reverend Simmons worked the land with his children and grandchildren, producing crops and selling the property's lumber. Simmons was creating generational wealth for him and his family, and the whites in the area were furious. In 1941, a rumor spread that there was oil in southwest Mississippi. A group of 6 white men decided they wanted Simmons' land and told him to stop cutting lumber. Simmons decided to consult a lawyer to work out the dispute and ensure his children would be the sole heirs to his property. This was to no avail. Years later, on Sunday, March 26, 1944, a group of white men arrived at the home of Reverend Simmons' son, Eldridge, and told him to show him to the property line. He agreed to do so, which would turn out to be a disastrous decision. While Eldridge Simmons rode with the men in their vehicle, they began to beat him and shouted racist language towards him. The men then found and dragged Reverend Simmons from his home about a mile away and began beating him as well. The men drove both Simmons and his son further onto the property and ordered Reverend Simmons out of the car, cut out his tongue, and shot him multiple times in front of his son. They then told his son that he needed to vacate the property in 10 days, or else he would be next. The white men who committed the lynching took possession of the land. The constable and sheriff concluded that Reverend Simmons had, quote, met his death at the hands of parties unknown, even though his son Eldridge and his 2 daughters, Emma and Lee, were present and able to identify by name at least 4 of the 6 men responsible. The sheriff couldn't care less. Emma, Lee, and other members of the family fled Amite County, Mississippi over the next 2 days, fearing for their lives, before their father's funeral on March 29th. Eldridge remained in town for the funeral, but was taken into police custody the next day supposedly for his own protection. Held in jail for more than a week despite being the victim, Eldridge was released from jail on April 8th and was urged to leave the county. Only one of the 6 white men responsible were ever prosecuted for Reverend Simmons' lynching. On November 1st, 1944, more than 7 months after their father was lynched, Eldridge and his sister Emma were arrested in New Orleans, Louisiana on charges that they had fled the state in order to avoid testifying as witnesses in the trial, even though they were told to leave Mississippi for their own protection. No matter what they did, the system or a group of white supremacists were going to bring them down. During the trial on November 11, 1944, Eldridge, Emma, and Lee all refused to name the perpetrators in the testimony because they feared for their own lives in the event of a conviction. The one white man was ultimately acquitted by an all-white jury because of, quote, lack of evidence. The land was never given back to Reverend Simmons' family, nor were any of the 6 men convicted for their crimes.